Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf samachay. Today we get to another interesting daf about the big famous debate between the Baytusim and the Prushim, the rabbis, about the date for Shavuot. So we're going to finish up with our previous sickle first. We were talking about this, right? We start talking about the Megillat Omer ceremony, but we're about to get to the ceremony. But before that, we have to talk about where would they get the crops from? Where would they harvest it? We learned it should be close to Jerusalem. And then we said, but there was a year where they couldn't. We had that interesting story. And then we saw about how they figured out where exactly they were supposed to get it from the person who was a mute, who was able to sign, give charades to them, kind of the early sign language to tell them where to find it. Then from that, we got into this Mordechai. Okay, we were talking about Mordechai, who Rashi says is definitely not Mordechai. Is Mordechai from the Megillah. Tosfot says no way can it be Mordechai from the Megillah because there's no way he was alive at the time of. Right, he was the one who figured out what the mute person was saying. There's no way he could have been alive in the time of the Cheshmonaim with Horkanus and Aristobulus. So Tosfot says it must be that there was someone basically in Mordechai's position in the temple at every time, and they called him Mordechai based on he took that position of Mordechai, and we're going to learn more about that today. So we finished with the story of these three women that brought these three sets of pairs of birds that they brought to the temple, the money for it, and the Kohen goes to buy them, but he's not sure what they meant. They think they meant for Maizavav, right? Even though the language didn't exactly sound that way in all of them. And then Mordechai suggests that maybe she really meant I was in trouble and I vowed that I would bring a pair of birds and that it wouldn't be one sin, one burnt offering, but it would be two burnt offerings. And we ended the daf with the same words as before, baduk v'eshkach. Okay, they checked out, was it really true? Meaning they asked the women then, what did you mean? And then the women, right, and as the Kohen obviously just assumed what they meant. So it's a good lesson in not always assuming you understand what people meant. Maybe you should always check, clarify. And it turns out Mordechai was right. V'hainu ditnan, and now we're going to see that he filled an important role in the temple in general, this Mordechai. Again, whether it's a particular character, particular person, or throughout the ages, there was always someone kind of in this position in the temple, the way it's understood by Tosfot. Hainu ditnan, it's a Mishna in Shkalim Petachya alakinim. Zem Mordechai. Okay, there was a guy whose name was Petachya. He was in charge of the kinim. What do we mean by the kinim? Well, kinim literally means pairs of birds, but or nest of birds. But what they really mean in the temple jargon is pairs. But what they really mean here is the shofarot. If you remember, there were 13 shofarot in the temple, and 2 of them were for the birds. One said chorim and one said goz leolah. Okay, they had different types of birds, but people would bring the money for those in. They would put it in that box kind of thing, and I guess label it or say what they were bringing it for, and then the Kohanim would go out and make it happen. So he was the one in charge of that, and they say his name wasn't really Petachia. That was a name he was called. Why was he called that in a second? We'll see. Zem Mordechai, really his name was Mordechai. Lama nekashmo Petachia, shepotech dvarim v'dorshan, because he opened up things and he would explain them. And he would darshan them basically to understand what they meant. Like the women with the zivati and the yamati and all that. Onati. V'yodea b'shivim lashon. He knew 70 languages, and that's what made him unique. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. How could you say what made him unique was that he knew 70 languages? Don't you remember the Gemara in Sanhedrin that says, Kulu Sanhedrin nami yadeh shivim lashon. The whole Sanhedrin knew 70 languages. Amar Rabban Yochanan. Rabban Yochanan says, as we learned in Sanhedrin, Ein moshivim b'Sanhedrin ela. We're now going to have a list. You cannot be in the Sanhedrin unless you fulfill the following things. Balei chokhmah, you have to be smart. Okay, you're going to see some of these things are strange. Some of them are pretty expected. You want them to be wise men. Balei mar'eh, they look good. Okay, they have a nice look to them. Okay, that seems a little strange. Why is that important? But remember, they stand in front of the people, right, they judge the people. People have to have respect for them, and often there's more respect if they have, the question is, what does it mean also? It doesn't necessarily mean good looking, but it means they have, right? So Ruth is suggesting here this imposing appearance. That actually appears in Rashi in the next words. Okay, it says Balei Koma, which means tall, which is a little bit strange. What does it mean, tall? But there Rashi says, Shir Tumehem Balei Din v'lo yishakhu. Okay, that people will listen to them, right? People who are tall, or it doesn't necessarily have to be in height, but have this as you say, imposing appearance. Okay, so Balei Mar'em maybe goes along with that. Okay, but these are people with presence. Balei Zikna, elderly people, but not elderly. They don't mean that. They mean wise older, right? They need to have years of experience to be able to understand people better and how to judge people. Balei Kshafim. Okay, this is a very strange one. They have to know magic. Okay, that's weird. Rashi brings two suggestions why they need to know magic. One is if they convict someone and the person decides to use magic so as to save themselves, right? They need to know how to counter that. It's a very interesting one. The other is that if they want to judge someone about being a mechashef, right, that they use magical practices, then we have to know what that is. So they had to understand how to do it, to be able to identify it. It's also an interesting interpretation. The whole Balei Kshafim is weird, as it is, so we have to come up with possible ways to understand it. V'yod'im shivim lashon. That's why we're here. They know 70 languages. All the Sanhedrin, it sounds like, had to know 70 languages. They also say sometimes that there would need to be at least 3 judges that knew 70 languages. I think not all of them, but anyway, that's another point. But the point being, this didn't make Mordechai unique. He wasn't the only one. And, right, what's the reason why they have to know 70 languages? The obvious reason, Shalote Sanhedrin Shomat Mipia Torgaman, right? If they're going to hear people's claims through a translator, we all know what happens when you use translation, right? Something is missing. Maybe that was at least before the world of AI. Not to say AI is perfect, but definitely makes translating a little bit easier. But again, you want to hear directly from their mouths what they're saying. You can understand, and know how to judge them better. Ella. So what made this Mordechai unique? Shu bayel lishane v'darish. He would mix languages and darshan them. Okay, whether you take a language like Yiddish, right? It's a combination of languages. Sometimes people talk in combination of languages, right? It's this mix between German and Hebrew, or even, people talk in Hebrewish in Israel, for example. So it's someone who understands that people are sometimes talking in different languages. I was thinking when I made Aliyah, I was 20 and I went to university here and I started reading academic articles, and they were so hard to understand. And the main difficulty was the English words that were written in Hebrew. I couldn't even identify that they were English words. Had I been able to realize it was an English word put into Hebrew, I would have understood it better. Right? Some are kind of obvious, like logistica, it's logistics. But when you have a word, I remember for hours I spent on this one word, panika. I didn't understand there was an English word because it didn't look like an English word. And, so it's when people speak in different languages and mix them, you have to be able to really understand properly what are they talking about. This actually goes back to that whole problem with the Rashi and the Tosfot argument. Which Mordechai are we talking about? Well, there's a Mordechai mentioned, which seems to be the same Mordechai from the time of Esther, in Ezra Nehemiah. And he's called Mordechai Bilshan, and that's the Bayel Lishane. He would mix languages and understand them better. And that's why he's called the Balshan. And this, by the way, is the Hebrew word for Balshanut, which is the language, linguistics, I guess is the translation. So what's interesting is they're using, again, the Mordechai that was back then for explaining about the Mordechai now. So again, that maybe supports Rashi and trying to say it's the same Mordechai. But again, hard to imagine that they're talking about the Mordechai from that time period, because they're clearly talking, at least in the Cheshmonaim time, it was much later. A story about Petach Yalakinim, we don't know when it's from, but we assume most of these sources, since they're Mishnaic sources, they're from much later in the Second Temple time period. And it's probably not the same person, but they're either using the fact that Mordechai Bilshan comes up there and says, talking about this other person, and maybe Tosfot's claim that we're talking about someone who was in the position of the Mordechai position in the temple. Anyway, they're all interesting theories. We don't know what's really going on here. Okay, with this, we're going to get started with the Omer ceremony. So, Ketzad Hemosim, what would they do? So the first thing they do actually happens before Pesach. Shluchei Beit Din, they send messengers from the court. Yotzim Erev Yom Tov, they go before Yom Tov, before Erev Yom Tov, or they go on Erev Yom Tov. Vosim, right, while everyone's getting ready for Pesach and the Korban Pesach, these messengers go out, and what do? Osin otam krichot b'mechubar lakarka. They basically take the standing stalks and they bundle them up together while they're still attached to the ground. What do? They want to make bundles so that when they come to do the Ktsira, which is going to happen on the night after the first day of Pesach, they're going to be able to cut them very quickly. Okay? This is right? There's possible reasons why they do this. The first thing I want you to realize is this ceremony goes on at night. Okay, it goes on the night of Tet Zayin Nisan, right? The first day of Pesach is Tet Vav Nisan, right? The night before, everyone was busy with the Korban Pesach. The next night, they're all going out to watch this Omer ceremony. Now, what's interesting is the fact that a ceremony takes place at night is interesting in and of itself because, remember, in those days, nothing happened at night, right? Everyone was in their houses at night. It was dark out. So first of all, I was thinking it's when the full moon is out. So it's also possible, there was light from the full moon and that enabled them to be able to do the ceremony at night. Now, the issue is that they want to cut, and the other thing that I thought was interesting, so they prepare so that it happens quicker. This is number one, probably people didn't love being out at night, and that's a possible reason. Also, I think you learn a lot about ceremonies here, right? You should always try to do as little as possible at this, whatever you could do before, so that you can make the ceremony shorter so as not to, waste people's time. When you have a lot of people coming, you want to make it move quickly. So this is also perhaps a reason why they got everything ready, right? It says, Shei noach liktzol, right? So that you can cut it very quickly and speed up the ceremony. Now, what's the issue? They didn't want to cut it before Pesach because then it would already start drying out. Remember, you want it as fresh as possible, caramel. So you don't want to cut it before because then it's like 2 days before you're cutting it. You're obviously not going to be able to cut it on Pesach because it's a Chag. You can only do things for the Chag. This is for the next day. So to do it beforehand would make the grains dry. We don't want that. So we wait. So we do a little prep work, but then we do it that night. So all the villages that were around there would come. Okay, so we'd have this public ceremony. You wouldn't have the whole nation there, but you would have a lot of people. And that we're going to see at the end of the Mishnah was to publicize this whole issue of, right, we talked about it before, that there's possible reasons of Berov Amadrat Melech, we want it to be with a lot of people, but it's more glorious. But it seems more, and the Mishnah is going to say it, it's to go against the Baytusim and say, this is the day we do the Korban Omer, and we want everyone to know, because think about it. If just some people went out, harvested it, went and did it in the temple, how many people were going to see it? How many people were going to know about it? So they wanted to make this public. So they took everyone out on that night, and everyone would see what day they're doing it. So now they say, they want to do a big thing about it. Okay, they want this to be a very public thing. So when do they start? As soon as it gets dark out. As soon as it's dark, Omer lahem. So then he says to them, Ba Hashemesh. Now we're going to have a whole question and answer ceremony going on here. So the reaper, now you remember there's 3 of them. Now they're not really mentioned explicitly in this Mishnah that there's 3 of them, but we did see before that there's 3 of them, right? That was the whole Mishnah before about on Shabbat, can you do 3? Assuming there's 3, seems like, again, there's different interpretations of this Mishnah, but we're going to see each question repeated. Now it's, each question here is mentioned, it's repeated, so it's repeated once. So you have 2 of every question, but it seems like each reaper, each harvester is asking the question himself. So we have 1, and then the other, and then a third. Even though it's only said twice, it's probably just they didn't want to say it 3 times in the Mishnah, but it means each harvester says this question. Okay, so we're now going to have a series of questions. B'Hashemesh, did the sun set? Omrim hein. This is another good tactic. If you're going to do a ceremony, it's boring for people to just sit there doing nothing. Here, the people were active participants in the ceremony, right? So you can learn a lot of things about ceremonies here, right? Try to prepare everything before so that you can move things along. And number 2, get people involved, because otherwise it's kind of boring and they're just standing around. So, but also, I think they wanted approval of everybody to say this wasn't just 3 people going out and doing this and deciding for themselves that this is the date, but that the community supported it and that this was something well accepted. And that seems to be the main reason why they're doing this. So, did the sun set? They would say, hein. B'Hashemesh, omrim hein. So there you see the question repeated. Magalzo, with this sickle, should I do it? Omrim hein. They say yes. Magalzo, with this sickle? Omrim hein. They say yes. Kupazo, should I use this basket to put it into? Omrim hein. Kupazo, omrim hein. So basically, we have this validation ceremony going on. They're validating all the actions that the harvesters are doing. B'Shabbat, they would add more. Another question, Omer, Shabbatzo, omrim hein. Shabbatzo, omrim hein. And then he asks, Ektzol, so should I cut? Omrim lo ktzol. Ektzol, lehem omrim lo ktzol. Okay, and that ends the ceremony of the question and answer, where he ends up getting validated, and probably, again, assuming each of the 3 reapers are asking the questions. Then, shalosh pa'amim al kol davar v'davar. Now they're telling you, and again, it really a little bit depends on how you understand the Mishnah, but it could be understood as each one asked the question 3 times. So while we saw it as 1 harvester, 2 harvesters, 3 harvesters, seems like possibly each of these questions was asked 9 times by each of them. Okay, that it could be the way to understand this. V'hein omrin lo hein hein hein, and then they answer yes, yes, yes. Kol kach lama. What is all this for? Mipnei ha-Baytusim. Okay, the Baytusim were another one of these kats, one of these groups of people, like the Karaim and like the Tzedukim, where they're understood, they took more literally the Psukim, although they have their own way of darshaning. And the main thing is that they have their way of understanding the Torah differently from the tradition that the rabbis have, which is the ones that appear in our Gemara, right? So the Gemaras are always centered around what we call the Prushim, and in their battles against the Tzedukim or the Baytusim or these different groups that existed. So this one was against the Baytusim. Shayu omrim ein ksirat Omer b'motzei Yom Tov. They would say the ksirat Omer isn't motzei Yom Tov. It's not the day after Pesach, Tetzayim b'Nisan. It's the first Sunday after Pesach. So whenever the first Pesach holiday falls, if it's on a Sunday, then the Omer will be brought on the following Sunday. If it's on Shabbat, then the Omer will be brought the next day. Okay, it all depends on, it's the first Sunday, right? It sounds like those American holidays, the first Monday after this, right? Like President's Day. Okay, we'll maybe reference back to President's Day. I think it's a good example, right? Nobody really knows when George Washington was born actually anymore because his date changes every year, right? It's just the Monday that's in February, that's around, the second to last week of February. So that's the way the Baytusim calculated, which does seem different than any other holiday in our religion, right? We don't have holidays that are like that, and it's probably what convinced the rabbis that this is not the right way to understand Mimochat Shabbat. And we're going to get into all the details in the fight between them. I will mention right now, which is Din and Daf this week of Alana is obviously on this topic, and what she does very interestingly is, number one, brings more modern commentaries and how they tried to find sources for the Pshat reading, because Mimacharat Shabbat is what it says in the Pasuk. It's from the day after Shabbat, and that's what makes the Baytusim have a much stronger claim to a certain extent, because it sounds like it's the day after Shabbat, right, which would be Sunday. And here the rabbis are going to come up with all sorts of drashot, and what she tries to suggest is she brings other interpretations that, number one, try to find it in the Pshat, try to explain the simple reading of it really is the way the Prushim understood it, the rabbis, and also give the theory behind it. What's the idea here, and why would it make sense that it be the first day right after Pesach? So it's it combines, kind of the elements of interpretation of Torah, like the simple reading of the Torah and how that could support, and also the machshava, the idea behind it. So it's an excellent shiur and well recommended. So let's get started with our Gemara. The first thing the Gemara does is quote Braita from Megillat Taanit. Megillat Taanit was a book, we've seen it before, where it's a book, it came up, if I remember, in Megillah, I think, which some people just recently learned. Comes up in a bunch of places. Anyway, Megillat Taanit, it comes up in Taanit. It's not about fasts. It's days, a list of days that were celebratory days where things happened on them, that were good things that happened, where you're not allowed to fast. And we're going to see right now that some of them you also can't give eulogies. Okay, because it's a happy day, right? Just like nowadays, right? You don't give eulogies generally on Rosh Chodesh, or you cut them shorter. Not everyone does that, but that's the general minhag, to cut them shorter. So Tanu Rabbanan. Elun yamim delo lehitane bahon. These are the days where we don't fast. Umitzotehen delo lemispe bahon. And some of them, we also don't eulogize people. Meresh yarcha de Nisan ad timniabe. So from the 1st of Nisan to the 8th of Nisan, itokim tmida. The Tamid sacrifice was established. Okay, what does this mean? We're going to see soon. Okay, again, it was another debate, this time with the Tzedukim, about something relating to the Korban Tamid. And basically what they're saying, in those 8 days, it's a good question why it's a range of 8 days, but it seems like in those 8 days, probably they had this big debate, public debate between them and the Tzedukim about this issue, which we'll see very soon. And the Prushim, the rabbis, won. So because of that, they celebrated the days. That's why it's a little weird. You would think it would be the day they won, but I assume it's the days that the whole debate went on in which they won the battle or the debate. Okay, so you can't eulogize and obviously not fast. Umitimnayabe, from the 8th, Va'ad Sof Moada, until the end of Pesach holiday, Itotiv Chaga de Shavuaya. The date of Shavuot was established, because remember, the day of the Omer affects the day of Shavuot. Okay, so if you can establish the day the Omer is brought, you can establish the day of Shavuot, because from that day, okay, we'll see the Psukim inside today, but from the day that you establish, you bring the Korban Omer, you start to count 50 days, 49 days, and the 50th day is Shavuot. So 1 year between the 8th of Nisan until the end of Pesach holiday, they were able to establish that our opinion is correct. Delola mispaid. So again, on those days, you can't eulogize. Okay, so now let's go back and explain. Why? Tzedukim omrim, Yachid mitnadev umevi Tamid. The Tzedukim said that an individual is allowed to bring the Korban Tamid. How do they get it? From a simple reading of a pasuk. My drush, what's their drasha? Et hakeves ha'achad ta'aseh baboker. The first keves you should do in the one sheep you should do in the morning. Vet hakeves hasheni ta'aseh ben harbaim. And the second one you should do in the afternoon. Now, you should do ta'aseh is in singular form. So they said individuals can bring korbanot tamid. Maya hadru. What did the rabbis retort in which they won the argument? Et korbani lachmi liishai tishmeru. Okay, my korban, which is tying there about the korban tamid, you should observe in plural. The word tishmeru is in plural. Shiyu kulam ba'im trumata lishkan. From there, they say this should not come from individual funds. It should come from communal funds, because there it's plural form. Okay, this isn't necessarily, their pshat reading is more of a likely pshat reading, right? This could go either way, because one's singular, one's plural, and the rabbis somehow claim that they won the battle. Okay, we don't see how exactly they won the battle, but we don't get too much about this because it's not really our topic. But we are going to delve very much into we're now going to start the whole sugya, which is going to continue into tomorrow, about the claims of the rabbis against the Baytusim, about how we know that Mimachorat Shabbat is really not on Sunday, the Sunday after the first day of Pesach, right? The first Sunday that comes out after Pesach. And we're going to see a slew of reasons, which always begs the question, right? If no argument must be strong enough, because if you have to bring a lot of them, okay, it kind of reminds me of the sugya, if you remember, of ayin tachat ayin, right? The ayin tachat ayin we say doesn't really mean an eye for an eye, and the rabbis all try to bring claims how we know this means money, monetary payment, and right, they're all just this claim after claim after claim after claim, because it's obviously very hard to prove, because really the simple reading does say an eye for an eye. So we're going to start our sugya now. Okay, that's the same we saw before. By the way, Rashi has a girsa that you do actually eulogize, that it's not as big as the other one, but anyway, our girsa says Delol Misped, we'll go with that. Shayu Baytusim omrim, Atzeret achara Shabbat. Okay, so the Baytusim would say the Atzeret is after Sunday, in other words, the Chag, Shavuot, that comes out 7 weeks later, always comes out on a Sunday, because we're going to start counting on a Sunday, it's going to end, Sunday it's going to come after the first, right? And the Omer is brought after Shabbat. Nitfal lahem Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai v'amar lehem. So Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I'm going to take this on. And he says to them, Shotim, you foolish people, Mirayin lachem, where'd you get this from? V'lo haya adam echad shaya meshiva. Okay, you have to remember we're seeing the story from the version of the rabbis, okay, the sages, who don't accept the Baytusim, so they're obviously going to make the Baytusim look bad, and they say, nobody had anything to tell us, right? Obviously, what they don't mention is it's the simple reading could be Mimachorat Shabbat, the day after Shabbat, which is Sunday. Okay, but they don't say that. They say nobody brought any good claim at all. They didn't have anything to say. The people were just silent. But chutz mizaken echad, there was one person, elderly man, shayam mifatpet kenegdo. He was just, Rashi says, what's mifatpet? B'divrei vikuchim. He was just throwing out something for argument's sake. Okay, you'll hear his claim and you'll see why. V'amar, Moshe Rabbeinu ohev Yisrael. I said, Moshe loved the Jewish people. V'yodea she'atzeret yom echadu, and he knew that Shavuot was only one day. Amar v'tikna achar Shabbat, kadei she'yu Yisrael mitangim shnei yamim. He said he obviously never heard of 2 days of Yantif that people struggle with, okay? But he said, it's, if you think about it, there's a lot of logic to this argument to a certain extent. I mean, obviously, it's kind of a ridiculous argument that Moshe is going to be able to say, I'm making the Chag every time after Shabbat so that people can have a long weekend, right? But we do like long weekends. That's exactly why President's Day is on a Monday, so that people can have a long weekend, right? It's exactly that claim. And if you think about it, all the other holidays are 7 days. This one's only 1 day, right? And sometimes, Shavuot comes and goes. And I mean, if you live abroad, then it's different because you have 2 days. But in Israel, it's like 1 day before you turn around, it's over. So people like a longer holiday, even though it does kind of cramp your style a little bit. But they basically say, right, and obviously I'm just using President's Day as an example, but yeah, there's Thanksgiving, there's Memorial Day, there's all these days that were put up with weekends. Memorial Day is the stranger one. It's actually a sad day, but yet it's put to have people have a nice long vacation beach weekend. But anyway, without getting into all the American holidays, but the idea is to basically have a long weekend and 2 days together, as if that's, right, a good thing. Again, it's not exactly like President's Day where you have a free day to just do whatever you want. There's a holiday with, rules and regulations and malacha you can't do. But okay, so there's certain logic to it, but it's a little bit strange. Kara alav mikrazeh. So comes the retort of Rabban Yochanan Zakkai, which is almost even stranger. He says, "Achadasar yom chorev derech har seir." You want to say Moshe was a nice guy and wanted to make the Jews have like a nice, easy life. Well, they were standing in the desert. They were 11 days to get into the land of Israel, turning now to Amud Bet. If you call Moshe a guy who loved the Jewish people and wanted to make their lives much easier, right? You have to add that. It's not like he just thinks Moshe didn't love the Jewish people. Why did he keep them in the desert 40 days? Now, it's obviously a ridiculous thing. Number one, it wasn't he who kept them in the desert. It was God. And maybe that's partly what Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying. It's not Moshe who determines things. It's God. Okay, that's one possible way of reading it. And the other problem, obviously, is the Jews sinned. And because of that, they were stuck there 40 years. It wasn't like it was Moshe's decision or even God, right? God's decision, but was based on their sin of the meraglim, the spies. But anyway, he's saying, and oftentimes, by the way, we have this, when we have a heretic or something that brings a question, oftentimes the rabbis respond in a ridiculous answer. Okay? And Rashi says it, he says, Dichoy ba'alma ka'amrele. Okay, and the Dibor matran imo avan haya lama ma'achran arba'im shana. He says, he was just throwing him off with a ridiculous claim. Mishum dehu haya omer divrei hevel. What he's basically saying is, you give me a ridiculous argument, I'll throw it back with a ridiculous argument. Okay? And he didn't really mean this, isn't really obviously the case, but what he's saying is your claim has no basis whatsoever. So Amar lo, so the obvious retort of the Baytusim elder was, Rebbe, bekachat hapotcheni. That's what you're answering me back. Now, this could mean one of two things. Number one, ridiculous claim. Number two, you didn't explain your position. In other words, you countered mine, but without coming up with a basis for yours, especially since yours really doesn't appear anywhere in the text as Mechorat Shabbat, not Mechorat Pesach. Amar lo shoteh. He says, you fool again. Right? You're comparing our Torah and our tradition to your silly, meaningless conversations. And I have a lot to say against you. So now he starts. Katuv echad omer. Okay, and he's just going to bring one claim, and then what we're going to do is we're going to bring a Breita with 4 other arguments. Then they're going to bring another source with other arguments. Okay, so we're going to have a long slew of arguments. Some of them will continue into tomorrow. So katuv echad omer tisperu 50 yom. V'katuv echad omer sheva Shabbatot tmimot tiyena. These are 2 psukim, one right after the other, in Vayikra Kaf Gimel, where it talks about the Omer and then leads into the Shtei Alechem, which you're supposed to bring right in the Omer, and then that leads into on Shavuot, you're supposed to count. So the first pasuk is actually the second one quoted here, so I'm going to read it first. Usfartem lachem mimochorat Shabbat. You're supposed to count for you from the day after Shabbat, miyom aviyachem et Omer hatnufa, from the day you bring the Omer, sheva Shabbatot tmimot tiyena. 7 complete weeks. Now, when you say 7 weeks, what do you usually mean? Weeks starting from Sunday. No, not necessarily, but right, we always think about this the way we know it is. It's 7 weeks starting from the day you start counting Sfarad Omer. But he says, literally, if you look at it in the Torah, 7 weeks should really be 7 full weeks, Sunday to Shabbat, Sunday to Shabbat, Sunday to Shabbat. The next pasuk, though, says, Mimachorata Shabbat HaShvi'i Tisperu 50 yom. Which is actually talking about the Shtei Alechem. Okay, the first one was talking about the Omer. This was leading to the Shtei Alechem. But basically they're saying you're supposed to count 50 days. So there it sounds like not necessarily weeks, Sunday to Shabbos, but whenever it is that you bring the Omer, count 50 days, right? It's really count 49 days, and on the 50th day you'll bring this korban. So that seems to contradict. Ha-ketzads, how does this work? Well, they're each talking about different scenarios. Kan b'yom tov shechali b'Shabbat. If Pesach happens on Shabbat, then you're going to count 7 full weeks from Sunday to Shabbat, because Tet Zayin, which is the day you're supposed to bring the Omer, is going to come out on Sunday. Kan b'yom tov shechali b'emtza Shabbat. But if it comes out during the week, then you're going to count 50 days. Okay, obviously, right, we know we count days, we count weeks, and that's the way we darshan this, but what he's trying to say is, from here you can learn that it's not always going to be Sunday, because otherwise there would be no point to mention 50 days. Okay, you could have just said 7 weeks, and we know weeks starting from Sunday to the end of the week, 7 times. Okay, now we have a siman. So that's the end of the Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai conversation, and that was when, I guess, they established it. He has the last word. He won the battle. Okay, and the debate. And there, they decided those days in which they debated, right, which went on for, I forget exactly, but something like, right, from the 8th day of Nisan until the end of the holiday. By the way, it wasn't clear to me, I should have looked this up, if the end of the holiday is the end of the first day or the whole end of Pesach, like if they only established it really at the end of Pesach. So Rashi just says Pesach there. I guess they mean the whole Pesach holiday. Okay, so now, in any case, by the way, if the whole thing is you can't do Hespedim, obviously on Pesach you're not going to do Hespedim either, and you're not going to fast either because it's a holiday. That's a whole separate thing. Okay, so now we get to a siman, okay, the Gemara likes that. Rabbi Eliezer Sofer, Rabbi Yeshua Moneh, Rabbi Yishmael Ma'amer, Rabbi Yehuda Lamata, siman. Okay, that's a siman for the 4 next claims we're going to see. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Enot Tzarich. So he responds now. Now we're continuing, and he says, and maybe this was also part of the debate, it's not clear, but he says, we don't even need your pasuk. And here we're going to start with a whole bunch of other proofs, okay, for how we get there. And like I said in the beginning, right, it's not necessarily, obviously none of these are great proofs, because otherwise they would just have one major proof. And they're each just trying to come up with answers. And tomorrow we're going to see all sorts of difficulties on many of these drashot that we're going to see. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, not tzarich, harei omer, tispor lach. Okay, now we switch to a different pasuk. In Dvarim, chapter 16, it says, Shiv'a Shavuot tispor lach, count 7 weeks for yourself. Me'echel chamesh b'kamat, techel tispor Shiv'a Shavuot, and there it's also mentioned in the context of, just take out my Tanakh for a second. Then it says, V'asita chag Shavuot l'Hashem Elokecha. Okay, so at the end of those 7 weeks, you do Shavuot. It's obviously talking about the same 7 weeks. So it says, tispor lach. How does he darshan this lach? What do you mean? Everyone's supposed to do it. And it also says, Usfartem lachem in the other chapter. Plural. This is singular. So he says from the singular, Sfirat Tuliyah Beit Din. I'm skipping the words in parentheses, because it means take them out. Yatzat Shabbat Breshit Shesfiratah B'chol Adam. What they're saying, lach, is that the counting is dependent on the court. Now, what counting is dependent on the court? When Sunday comes out every week is not dependent on the court. That everybody knows. So if it was dependent on that, it wouldn't say Sfartem lach, which means the court. Okay, again, it's a drasha here. But the drasha is that when it says singular, lach, it means it's a count that's dependent on the court. Now, the court determines when the new moon is. Right? We're almost Rosh Chodesh this month, right? It's determined based on the new moon. So that's determined by the court. Therefore, this must be connected to a date on the calendar and not a day of the week. That's the theory. Okay, next claim. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Amra Torah minei yamim v'kadesh chodesh. Okay, this is actually based on a completely different context. In Bamidbar Yud Aleph, with the whole, when the people were complaining they don't have meat, so it says they're ad chodesh yamim. And what they learn here is a month is determined by days, which means that minei yamim, right, v'kadesh chodesh. You're going to count days and then do the new moon. Like, let's say, for example, if you're in Shul on Shabbat, they announce the molad, when the molad comes, when the new moon is seen. Could be any time of day or night. But you don't determine, oh, the new moon is right now, this is going to be Rosh Chodesh starting from this minute of the day, right? You determine based on a full day. There's a full day, and then you count months. Minei yamim v'kadesh atzeret. Same thing for atzeret. You're going to count full days, and then you're going to get to, at the end of the 50, right, the 49 days, you'll get to Shavuot. Ma chodesh. So now, since they're both kind of counted in a similar way, they're days that lead up to a particular day, right, or a particular something, right, whether it's a month or whether it's Shavuot, they're going to say like this. Ma chodesh samuch lebiatoni kal. Now, a chodesh, you know when it's coming because you know when the previous month started and you're counting from then, right, from a particular day that's a noticeable day, you're counting from there going forward. Af atzeret samuch lebiatani keret. So also Shavuot must be where you're counting from a particular day. And what they mean here is a particular date. Just like the first of the month, you start counting till the end of the month. From Tetzayim B'Nisan, or you know Pesach is there. In other words, if you have a marker in the calendar, from there you know you're going to, what's our marker? Pesach. You know this Pesach, and you know the Omer starts the next day. If 1 year it starts 2 days after Pesach, and 1 year it starts 4 days after Pesach, and 1 year it starts 6 days after Pesach, it's going to be very confusing. People don't have a clear marker as to where to start it. Now, of course, you could say it's just Sunday, right? The same way, right? With Thanksgiving, or, like there could be rules, but it's not as clear, and it's not like a date in the calendar that's going to help you to determine this. That seems to be the prevailing thing, which, like Rosh Chodesh, isn't based on a day of the week. It's based on a day in the calendar. So that's what they're basically saying here as the comparison. You can see that these are not the strongest arguments. Ve'im tomar atzeret le'olam achar Shabbat, and if you say it's always on Sunday, he'achteni keret mishel faneh, right? You won't know when to start, right? When to expect it to be coming, because it's always, right? It's not connected to any particular date on the calendar. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Amra Torah have Omer bepesach, u'shtei alechem ba'atzeret. So now we're comparing the Omer and the Shtei Alechem, which make a lot of sense. In this case, we're going to compare them next argument because of the psukim, but now we're going to compare them because of the content. Both of them permit chadash. Remember, they're both brought from the new grains. The Omer is brought from the new barley crop, and the Shtei Alechem is brought from the new wheat crop. And the Omer permits the new crop to be eaten by everybody, but not yet to be brought on the altar. And the Shtei Alechem permits the new crop to be brought on the altar as well. So they're similar, okay? And the Torah said, bring the Omer on Pesach, and Shtei Alechem ba'atzeret. They're each connected with a holiday, right? The Omer is connected with the Pesach holiday, however you read it, whether you say Menachorat Shabbat is the Shabbat after Pesach, or, right, but the Sunday, after Pesach. But either way, right, it's connected to a holiday, and Shtei Alechem is obviously connected to Shavuot. So ma lahalan regel utchilat regel. So just like Shavuot happens at the beginning of the holiday, well, there is only one day of the holiday, but it's as the holiday begins. Afkan regel utchilat regel. This is going to also be at the beginning of the holiday. Now, it can't be on the first day because it says mimachorat Shabbat, and we assume that machorat Shabbat means the day after the first day of the holiday. And you can distinguish also Shavuot's only 1 day. Pesach has 7 days, so don't do it on the first day, which is Yantif. We'll do it on the next day. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer. Again, he's going to compare these two. Very similar, but in the comparison is going to be done by psukim. Gzera Shabbat. Ne'emar Shabbat lemala v'ne'emar Shabbat lemata. Those are the two psukim we saw before. Usfartem lachem mimachorata Shabbat. That was chapter 23 in Vayikra, verse 15. And that's basically talking about the Omer. And then Ami machorata Shabbat Shvi'it. In the next pasuk, Tisbru chamishim yom v'yikraftem mincha chadasha. That's the Shtei Alechem. Both say the words mimachorata Shabbat. Okay, so then they're going to say Gzera Shava. Again, same idea. Ma lahalam regel utchilat regel samuchla. Here they just add the word samuchla. It's right near the beginning of the regel. In Shavuot, it's actually at the beginning of the holiday. Afkan regel utchilat regel samuchla. So again, we're going to compare the two. The only difference here really is on what basis we're comparing it. One is because of chadash, and the other, the new crop, and the other is because of the words in the pasuk. Okay, so we're going to assume this means regel utchilat regel samuchla, that it's going to be right near the beginning of the holiday, which will get you onto Tetzayim Nisan. Again, if you always say it's the Sunday after, it could be much farther from the beginning of the holiday. It could be at the end of the holiday. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, so that was the whole Breita where we had basically the argument between first Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai and the Baytusim, the elder Baytusim, and their arguments back and forth, right? Not so much back and forth, but a little bit. And then we get these other 4 opinions of rabbis who say, oh yeah, we don't like your proof, we'll give a different proof. Okay, here's a different proof, and each one brought a different proof. Now we're going to start another Breita with a whole bunch of answers. We're only going to get to one so far today, but we'll see more tomorrow. And then, as I said, we're going to get to difficulties on these commentaries, on these drashot. So Tanu Rabbanan, the first thing is a different drasha. Sfartem lachem, as we said before, it's in plural in the other place, in Vayikra. Shetei sfira l'chol echav echad. This means everyone's commanded to do this. Okay, although women are exempt because it's time-bound mitzvah. But it means all men, all individuals are commanded to do this, all individual men. Mimachorat Shabbat, mimachorat Yom Tov. And then it goes into the date. And then it says, what is it? From the day after Yom Tov. Oh, eno ela l'machorat Shabbat Breshit. Maybe it means, right? Shabbat Breshit always means, right? The Shabbat of Breshit, which means the after Shabbat, after Saturday, meaning Sunday. Okay, so maybe it means that, which is basically the Baytus claim. Now they say, no, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Harehu Omer tisperu 50 yom. This is a bit of a strange one, okay, or not the most convincing. Count 50 days. It sounds very clear. Every year you're going to count only 50 days. Again, you're really going to count 49, and the 50th day is Shavuot. Now, if you say Sunday, פעמים שאתה מוצא 51, פעמים שאתה מוצא 52, 53, 54, 55, 56. He goes through all the possibilities. He says sometimes you're going to end up with 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56. Okay, this is a little bit of a strange claim, because what do you mean? If you always count 50 days based on the Mechorat Shabbat, always from the Sunday after Pesach, you're always going to have 50 days. And it's, why you claim it's going to be 51, 52, 53, 54, 55? What he seems to be saying, which again is a weak claim, but what he's saying is we're assuming somehow these 50 days are either starting from the first day of Pesach, the day after the first day of Pesach, which is strange because that's the whole argument. Okay, but what he's saying, perhaps he's saying, also if you take every year, Shavuot is going to be different every year, basically. You're going to end up with completely different dates. It's going to be very confusing because if you go, 1 year, it's going to be, let's say, 50 days exactly right after Pesach. But then another year, it'll be 52 days or 56 days after Pesach. And you're going to end up with something very confusing. Okay? That's what he sounds to be saying. Again, it's a little hard to understand his argument because the easy way to counter it is what do you mean? You're always counting 50 days from Mechorat Shabbat, and that's just the way it is. So what his problem is not 100% clear. But he seems to somehow say it's obvious still it has to connect somehow with the beginning of Pesach, which again is not so obvious to the Baytusim, but it's obvious to him. Okay, so that's the end of that claim, and we'll continue with Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, Omer no tzarich. Again, he's saying, I don't need your drasha, I have my own drasha. Okay, and we're going to continue on with a few more tomorrow. So let's review our daf. We started with this Mordechai and what made him so unique and special, and how is he different from, let's say, the other Chachamim of the Sanhedrin, and he understood language much better and how to understand people. Then we moved on to this ceremony that's described in the Mishna of what they did, this public ceremony, and how they did it to basically show people, what they, this back and forth question answer, to basically involve the people, show that publicly, right, both to proclaim it in a public manner that we are correct, this is the day. From there we got to Megillat Taanit, which talked about 2 sets of days that became, so to speak, festivals for the Jewish people because they were days on which they succeeded in countering the claim of the right and establishing. What really happened in these days was that they won this debate and it became the general, because we think about always what do you mean? The Prushim were the main people, but obviously they weren't. There were other groups and fighting over, and they had to convince. Probably, there were some that were very clear about the Baytusim and some about the Prushim that convinced all the people in the middle who to follow and when we're doing this. And it affected major things because it affected the date of Shavuot, certainly in that argument, other than the Korban Tamid, which affected the Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice. So they won these debates with the Tzedukim about the Tamid and with the Prushim with the Baytusim about the date of when we do the Omer, which then affected the date of Shavuot, which was really what is important to them when Shavuot comes out. That's why they set it as, the date of Shavuot. And we saw the different arguments, number one, between Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai and the Baytus elder, and then 4 other arguments we saw after that, the other rabbi said, and then we started with a new Braita with a slew of arguments, and we started with Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. And like we said, none of these arguments are the most convincing, but they each are trying very hard to make attempts to try to prove their opinion. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, peaceful, quiet day, and wishing everyone strength to get through this difficult period.